So friends, in the first part of the discussion, Dr. Richa Bajaj has laid bare before us the scenario in the 1930s in England, and 1930s was preceded by the Second World War, which began in 1939, and on that day when the war began, W.H. Auden was face to face with the beginning of something which will be totally devastating at the social and political level. So that poem has already been touched upon. So I leave it to Dr. Richa Bajaj to continue with the discussion further regarding that poem, and later on perhaps to take another poem also, so that with the help of those two poems we also become literate about the atmosphere in England in the mid 20th century. So, Dr. Richa, over to you regarding the 2 points.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. So, I'd begun my discussion on September 1, 1939. Now, I'm taking this stanza 5, from the poem, and I'd like to then connect it to the next poem that I want to take up. Now, if you look at this stanza 5, you find that he's talking, so just to build a kind of a recap, that he's already spoken about how he's responding to the phenomena of war the moment he gets to hear the news of Germany invading Poland, right? So that's the background of this poem, and then on he goes on to talk about different centuries and different ages. For instance, he refers to Martin Luther in the poem and his act of fighting against a regime and fighting for Protestant religion. He also refers to Hitler indirectly, talking about how Hitler we might want to go and historians would want to uncover this idea of what made Hitler in that sense, and and go into his history, right? So, but the idea is that what made the man. He in fact says that Hitler grew up in a particular grew up in a very intimidating circumstance where his father was very brutal towards him, and which actually where he was the victim of that kind of violence, suggesting that in a way that maybe that violence, and now the victim becomes a victimizer. So these are kind of references that you can draw from the previous stanzas in the poem, where he's constantly referring to, we can go back to seeing what made this man, what made this kind of a psychopathy, and this kind of a god who's now come to cloud our lives. So in a way, I think that he's tried to portray this kind of a picture of Hitler, referring to Linz, for instance, where Hitler grew up, and referring to a psychopathic god that is of course indirectly a reference to Hitler. So while he is doing that, he is also bringing in the idea of people's reaction to this. He says that today we can sit back, we can look at what made Hitler, but that is not going to solve the problem, because the truth is that people are going to suffer because of it, right? And these are the people who are defenseless, he says, under this kind of night, and the world lies in stupor lies. This is a quote from stanza 9 where he says, defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies. So suggesting that this is the larger mood of the time, and this is what the people in general are going through. In stanza 5, for instance, he talks about this particular image, and I quote, faces along the bar cling to their average day. The lights must never go out, the music must always play, lest we should see where we are, lost in a haunted wood, children afraid of the night, who have never been happy or good. Unquote. So this is how he builds this kind of a idea, where people's reactions, people's responses, and again the idea of obsessing over private lives, and people, we must continue to go to the bar. Again, if you notice, this poem is written in the bar, when he's in a bar and he's looking at strangers who all share the same plight of the war. They don't know what to do with it because the war is going on. They cling to their average lights and average day, and the music must always play on, because otherwise they'd become aware of where they are. They are in haunted woods, and this is the the image of the war that he builds in a world which is fraught with violence, the images of the haunted wood. And he says, we are the children who are afraid of the night, right? We don't want to face the reality, and therefore we'd rather go to a bar, drink ourselves and listen to music and go back home and sleep. So we are children who have never been happy or good. Now, the background to this poem, September 1, 1939, is very similar to the poem The Age of Anxiety, which is also set in a bar. And in fact, it's the longest poem of Auden.
Before you begin with this, let me, this is what I felt, the way he uses language, a language shorn of all its niceties, and the simplest of words are good and happy. So they are not neither happy nor good.
Right.
Now, what is the difference between happy and good?
But also in the sense that I think he's using the biblical Christian model of good children, you know, children of the night. When he says children afraid of the night who have never been happy or good, because that is what Christianity teaches them, to be good citizens, to be good people,
Yes.
right, and find happiness in that kind of world. So I think he's also referring to the loss of, and this in a way reminds me of Yeats' Second Coming in that sense, you know, that Christianity has also lost its ground, right. You could connect it to the First World War situation where T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland, you know, of the loss of any faith. So I think the loss of faith is how I read this particular sentence. The moment it turns to happy or good, which Auden could be referring to the Christian faith.
That's a fine
here.
insight, yes, I agree.
So he could be referring to the Christian faith. But what I mean to say is that this background, you actually feel September 1, 1939 as if has been carried forward in another poem and in a more extended manner. So the setting is actually very similar in The Age of Anxiety, which is the second poem I wanted to bring up for discussion. It is also set in a bar, you know, and in a bar which has 4 protagonists who are lost and uncertain in a world fraught with violence of the war. So you can see that the similarity between the two poems. The 4 people, actually there are 3 men and a woman, along with a stray few customers who are there. They all are seeking relief from the tensions of the war period, and in New York again, and it is so this poem is published in 1947. So you can see that the mood has lingered. You know, the 1939 is a poem which is written at the onset of the Second World War, and 47 is when you can already see the impact of the war or the kind of results of the war. So I think it continues in this kind of a mood. It extends the previous poem, and the metaphor is turned into a kind of a full-fledged sort of a kind of a epic, I would say. Now the poem has been titled a Baruch Eclogue, right? Very strange, because it actually turns the whole logic of eclogue on its head, because an eclogue is supposed to be a pastoral poem which is supposed to talk about landscapes, etc. It is of course a classical form that he's using, because Auden is fond of using these forms, and he is experimenting, as I said, with different forms, and particularly in the poem The Age of Anxiety, he's actually time and again using different poetic forms, and time and again trying to bring in a different genre of poetry itself. He's very experimental in this poem, and it is associated, this form of the eclogue is associated with Virgil, for instance, about the meditations of the shepherds. Here of course the setting is a bar in New York City, so it's far away from any kind of a pastoral poem, and from the bar to an apartment of the woman Rosette. So you know, it's not anywhere close to any landscape, but how Auden is trying to visualize this is that the characters enter these strange landscapes in their mind. You know, so this poem has a lot of stream of consciousness. You have characters, and where there's a prologue and followed by, you know, the characters stream of consciousness, you know, different daydreams or their monologues, and then they join in and talk about where somebody tells us life story, you know, so there are interspersed in that manner. So but why Baruch then? You know, because Baruch here of course refers to the poem, you know, as a kind of a medieval alliterative sort of verse. He's using a lot of alliteration, and there's a lot of ornamentation, like, you know, you would find in Dryden's, for instance, works, etc. A lot of that kind of influence. So I think it's a difficult poem because form is also difficult, you know, using ornamentation, medieval alliterative poetry, using a classical form of the eclogue, and then talking about the situation which is as banal and as mundane as people sitting in a bar, strangers, and talking about their lives.
And see the range and the knowledge of medieval period, the ancient period and the modern period.
Right.
And connecting that, as you rightly say, with form.
No, so what I mean is he's using these forms, say the form of, Dryden's form, the Augustan poets using that form, Virgil's form, bringing them to the 20th century to talk about what? People meeting in a bar, strangers meeting in a bar, talking about their helpless situation, drinking up, passing out. This is what he's talking about.
There is a continuum, but it becomes more and more ironical.
It becomes ironical because the content is not as elevated and grand as the form. The form is grand, right? But the content is absolutely below average. It is kind of an ordinary life of people who are drinking up and then passing out. So I think he's trying to bring out that kind of irony, and the poet therefore depicts these solitary drinkers who during the war years find solace in speaking to one another. There is a kind of mutual agreement and acknowledgement also of the suffering that they are all a part of, and hence a kind of maybe mutual sympathy or compassion, maybe yes, a sense of solidarity that you see among strangers who have nothing else to do. So in fact Auden won the Pulitzer Prize for poetry in 1948 for this very poem, and which was published in 1947. This long poem, it is a book length poem, it's a full book, and in fact it is his longest and the least read poem. It's the least read poem.
It's a complex poem.
And the least, the one that got him the Pulitzer Prize, and the least read poem, the least also discussed poem in that sense, controversial poem, the one that is disliked and liked equally. I mean, there is a musician who actually made a symphony on it. He felt so passionately moved by this particular poem that he actually made a symphony on it, and critics have gone on to say that the symphony is perhaps better than the text. So there is a kind of a mixed review, and which makes it very fascinating in that sense. I feel that that he's able to call it an age of anxiety, that he's also defining it. Is he taking up a role of a prophet or somebody who's talking about the very age? He's trying to define the very age in his own time, and that creates its own poem. It's an ambitious poem, and that creates its own problem because you're too close to the time, right? But I think it's a remarkable feat because he's able to capture the psychological I'd say the psychological bent of the time in that sense, because Auden was always fascinated by the psychological in that sense. So historical reality and insight into the human condition together made this kind of age of anxiety, I think, significant.
Had he at the time shifted to America?
Yes, he shifted to America soon after 1939 when the war broke out. In fact, it is told that he wrote this poem September 1, 1939 while he was in a bar in America in towards the end. So he very soon moved from England. 1939 is where he moves. Then he also becomes a naturalized citizen of America. So he is a British American poet in that sense. Grew up and spent his early years in England, but then moved to America. And soon, he also joined the different groups, and he was teaching in different universities, etc. So, and writing at the same time, writing poetry. So Age of Anxiety is written during the 1940s, the period where he was in America writing, teaching courses in different American universities. So while he was giving these lectures, he was at the same time writing this particular poem, that is the Age of Anxiety. And it actually captures the dilemmas and apprehensions of individuals during the period of the World War. So I think that's why it is both a historical poem but also a psychological narrative, because it goes into the minds of these different characters who are there in the poem, and talks about this particular age itself. In fact, the prologue, I'd like to quote from the prologue itself. The long this poem has the prologue by the poet, and I quote, he says, "When the historical process breaks down and armies organize with their embossed debates the ensuing void which they can never consecrate, when necessity is associated with horror and freedom with boredom, then it looks good to the bar business."
Devastating, I must say, the way he is able to present all these different worlds somewhere there into a kind of unity that becomes poetic towards the end. It is a very different kind of, and a very complex poem.
Yes, and the fact that he is able to bring his insight to bear on his poetry, right? When he says, when the historical process breaks down, it's a moment, that is the age of anxiety that he's referring to, and armies organize with their embossed debates the ensuing void, which they can never consecrate, you know. When necessity is associated with horror and freedom with boredom, right?
So all the good points are gone haywire.
Yeah, the whole logic of rationality, of whatever principles that we abide as dear and value, they've all been distorted. Necessity is associated with horror. I mean, you would think freedom with necessity, necessity as life, necessity as human relationship or whatever, right? Or work ethic. But here necessity is associated with horror, that horror is a necessity, that war is a necessity. The whole discourse of war, you know, that is presented to the people is one where horror of war is seen as necessity.
Us and you can't do without it.
Yes, because, you know, the enemy is going to come to kill us, so we have to kill the enemy, and in the process we'll be killed. And freedom is associated with boredom. He says that's when that looks good for the bar business, and that's the setting of the poem.
Wow.
There is a bar where people come. So further the poet suggests that in wartime, and I quote, everybody is reduced to the anxious status of a shady character or a displaced character.
And you call it a prologue.
Yeah, this is the prologue. This is the prologue.
So
after that, this is the statement of the poet, and then these characters are going to come in the so which is why I call it a very dramatic poem, because this is the background that is given to us, and then we are introduced to the characters, and each characters have their own set things that they say. There is Marlin, who's a medical intelligence officer. There is Amber, who's a young handsome sailor. There is Rosetta, who's a store buyer. She makes a lot of money but also daydreams. There is Quant, who's a middle-aged clerk who's absolutely harassed by his occupation, by the monotony of his occupation. So we enter each character's stream of consciousness, you know. For instance, Rosetta imagines, and I quote something from the poem, Rosetta imagines the world that would come, and she's imagining this world, and she says, I quote, odorless ages, an ordered world of planned pleasures and passport control.
See the alliteration also.
Yeah, so there is alliteration, as I said. In fact, in each line there are at least 3 alliterations that he's planned, which is the alliterative verse that I was talking about. So, odorless ages, an ordered world of planned pleasures and passport control. Sentry go sedatives, soft drinks, managed money, a moral planet tamed by terror, unquote.
And each word, you know, means something that connects all these words.
So it's not like he's used these words for alliterative purposes, but that they actually mean this is the world. And you know, I would say Auden was probably a prophet, because this is the kind of world we live in. We are all driven by passport controls. You know, there are passports, there are border issues, there are refugees. I mean, you have borders and therefore you have refugees. Suppose you didn't have borders, right? Suppose you didn't have passports. So we are always in a kind of I think a zoo in that sense, where everything is planned, all of us are caged and everybody can move within that. So you are always controlled by the mechanism. You are tamed by terror, you are controlled by passports, there is pleasure which is available to you, but that is planned pleasure, and this is
hardly pleasure,
which is hardly pleasure. I mean, it's planned, like a zoo is planned, you know.
It's a kind of business.
Yeah, it's an ordered world, right? And there are soft drinks, again reference to soft drinks, etc. is the capitalist world that we are moving into, managed by money. He says a moral planet, which is so contradictions, you know. He calls it managed by money, a moral planet.
And imagine this poem was written in 1948 and
47, yes.
47, and after 70, 80 years, we still find the world the same, if not worse.
Yeah, I mean, how is it ironic? Yes.
But
what I find is that you know, with such powerful lines, I wouldn't. I mean, and the reason why he got the Pulitzer probably at that time, but I wouldn't understand why this is still seen as a kind of a disaster poem in that sense, or seen as a poem lacking in intensity.
No, it is very intense.
And this is what is happening.
Intense.
So there are these characters who are talking, and who are imagining, like Rosetta is imagining this world, then there is a conversation, and in the backdrop there is a radio that keeps giving out these depressive newses of the war, that so many fighter jets have gone in, so many people have been killed, that the sky is full of planes now. So the characters come back to the stark reality. There is a kind of an imaginative world, that landscape that I was talking about, and then the stark reality, which is which makes them conscious of the world that they inhabit through the radio, which is giving out these newses, this news of war and suffering and killings and all of that, and they are drawn together therefore by this mutual suffering, and they consider their historical plight together, and the three then join Malin, who is telling them about his life stories, etc., and very soon they all become a part of the whole narrative of the 7 ages of man, and the 7 stages of man, and they are discussing those. So they're intoxicated and delirious because of the liquor that they are consuming. They are stimulated because their minds are going in different directions, and there are these inward monologues and dream soliloquies that take place for each character as you enter that world. So very Freudian in that sense, very
and the poet
stream
is
of
very
consciousness,
deftly controlling the entire movement of the poem.
Right, and with alliterations that are going on, and they are all dissatisfied with the present world. All these characters, they begin to dream of therefore they begin to dream of a kind of an unhistorical or an ahistorical place where happiness would be a possibility, right? And they very soon realize that their lives constitute continual hope and disappointment, and this is where this is what is tragic, right? So I think the fact that there is a kind of a helplessness, but there is anger which is very much present in the prologue and in the dream sequences that take place, right? You find that the characters meditate on their lives, their hopes, their losses, and on the general human condition, and literally what happens is that they all decide to, they are drinking up, they find a booth for themselves in a restaurant, they sit and they talk and they drink, then they decide to go to Rosetta's place. Rosetta's flirting with the young sailor, the other 2 middle-aged men, they all go to her place, but the 2 of them leave. Rosetta thinks that she might have a romantic sort of an association with this young sailor who's pledging this kind of love for her, but then very soon he crashes and he passes out in her bed. So that's how things move, but there have been,
it's difficult to compare geniuses, but I think he has in this poem outdone T.S. Eliot vis-a-vis Wasteland.
Yeah, I do think so. Like T.S. Eliot, he's what also marks him in a way, I think what also distinguishes him from T.S. Eliot in that sense from Wasteland, if you were to compare, is that T.S. Eliot is very determined to find a solution, and when he cannot find a solution, he goes into Christianity or he goes into Shanti.
He is not a democratic soul.
Right. He's on a mission to find. He finds a lot of things going wrong, but then he's also on a mission to find a center.
Prove a point.
Yeah. No, but also to find a center that he can find faith in some form. I think because Auden remains angry till the end. He's angry, he's irritated, he's just disgusted by this world. He's not giving you any answers. I mean, what happens? Rosetta goes, they all go to her apartment, 2 of them leave, the 3rd one crashes in her bed and she's there. That's it. So he just leaves it right there in the middle without, in a way, taking you towards an end, because the end is almost impossible at this particular point. Things just are left, and I think this is a very American way of writing. Most American writers would do that. I think and that's what.
Can you explain?
Like for instance, if you think of, I think a lot of American writers, I'm actually.
Cosmopolitanism?
No, I think American writers during the Second World War or after the Second World War, and the writers who were dealing with the Great Depression years, they are critical but also open-ended. they do not necessarily take you, they would often leave you right in the middle and nowhere. Actually, maybe not even Pinter to some extent, I think, does that. He just leaves you somewhere in the middle and just leaves you for to fend for yourself. So he doesn't dictate any sort of an end. So I think Auden also does not dictate an end. I mean, there are critics who have tried to philosophize this poem and refer to these characters as abstractions, thought abstractions.
But Pinter follows W.H. Auden.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yes.
So maybe I should correct myself and not say all American and English.
No. What I say is that
I was comparing with T.S. Eliot.
No, he may have taken his cue from people like W.H. Auden and American poets.
Yeah, that's true. That is true, because because again you find that Auden is not necessarily giving you an answer to the problem, and he's angry. What saves him, I think, is his anger and his disgust, and which comes in the form of witty, ironic statements such as these. So as I was saying that a lot of critics have also referred to this poem in terms of an abstract thought, where they thought the characters stand for certain abstractions. For instance, Marlin stands for thought.
Please take 1 minute to sum up this poem, The Age of Anxiety.
The Age of Anxiety, I think, is is a reference. It registers, one, the atrocities of the war. It registers the atrocities of one war. So therefore, it is an anti-war poem out and out, much in the vein of September 1, 1939. In fact, I'd say that the two could be read together as a unit, because the one is September 1, 1939 is written at the outset of war, and this is at the fag end of it. And so therefore, this registers that kind of atrocities of the war. But it also, I think, is one of the few poems, or the first poems, to talk about the atrocities or the genocidal murder of millions of Jews at the time, and captures that emotion, I think, very well. So for me, it is that which it has a kind of a very compulsive quality, this poem, which compels you also to think and react, and you are confused and in different worlds together. So I think it's an imaginative leap of a very unique kind, but also politically very much on the path of the left.
So friends, with this discussion, which is quite intensive in terms of the two poems that have been discussed, we come to the end of the lecture, end of the discussion, and we become more aware about the reality of the surroundings that we have with us, and we become critical as well as Dr. Richa Bajaj has pointed out, self-critical. So these are the strong points of W.H. Auden, and he stands out, I think, in the crowd of poets that came into the American and the English scene in the post Second World War period. Thank you.